Hi, I'm Romane Dold, considered to be the local historian here. I'm 82 years old, been here all my life. I'm a member of the Murray County Historical Society Board, and so Currie is celebrating 150 years this year. We've been in existence a long time, the oldest town in Murray County. So we had a walking tour this morning, and you'll be seeing that in the following video. We walked and talked about the history of the business district of Currie. Welcome everybody, town of Currie that's been here for 150 years. So we hope you have a real enjoyable weekend if you're going to spend more than just today here. A couple of things. First of all, I've got a granddaughter over here that's holding the speaker. Hopefully you'll be able to hear most of what I'm saying. I've got a couple of daughters that are also working with the photos, and they'll be passing out photos as we go along. Just so we're going to be talking mostly about buildings that haven't been here or that aren't here today. So we'll give you a little visual by showing you those photos. You just pass them around in the audience. Everybody sees them, you can get them back to her. We're not too concerned about keeping them, so just make sure that everybody sees them that wants them. This microphone system, it's the first time I've ever used it. I hope that it'll be good enough for everybody to hear. We've got a cameraman here that's going to videotape the whole thing too, so. And I see we've got press from Tracy, so we're getting to be quite popular down Currie this weekend. Just excuse me for reading. I'm going to read a lot of what you're going to hear today. It's all my own material, but the old memory isn't what it used to be, and I can't remember everything that we're going to talk about today. So, you're going to hear names that are maybe familiar to you, and a lot of them that won't be familiar. You'll be listening about buildings that you didn't know existed, and you'll hear about buildings that you heard some stories about. So, with that, I would like to have you visualize what this area might have been like 150 years ago. There weren't any buildings here, obviously. The only humans here were the Native Americans, and most of them were out around the lake. Very, very few white people. It was all grass, wildflowers, hardly any trees. The only trees were out by the lake and along the Des Moines River. So if you can visualize, that prairie was just what it was. And you can imagine, or can you imagine, people coming here 150 years ago into a desolate place like that. But that's what two gentlemen one by the name of Archibald Currie, who was 56 years old at the time, along with his son Neil, who was 30 years old. They came from St. Charles, Minnesota. Originally, they came from Scotland. And old Archibald was an adventurous type. And he just wanted to get a little bit further west, to the frontier. If you know where St. Charles is, it's down by the Winona area. So the two of them came by train from St. Charles to New Ulm, and then from New Ulm by horse and wagon. And they came out here and they fell in love with this area because of the lakes and because of the Des Moines River. And Archibald thought that this would be the ideal place to build a mill. And so that was the start of Currie. They laid the foundation for the mill that year in 1871, and then they went back to Winona for the winter. They came back in 1872, finished the mill, and platted the town of Currie. And from there, of course, it grew. People started coming in. The houses started being developed, and Currie just started growing. And it was really because of those two men. So the mill, if we get started here, if you would pass around photo number 1, and it is about the mill, it shows the old mill. It's the Silvernail mill at that time because Currie sold it to Silvernail later on. But the mill turned out to be a huge success because of the next closest mill was in New Ulm, 75 miles away. So Archibald's son-in-law, who was Amos Crowell, he also later became part owner in the mill. He was quoted in the newspaper by saying, "Monday was always a favorite day at the mill, and I have counted over 20 teams unhitched around it." So 20 teams coming in, farmers bringing their wheat in to get ground into flour. And that was a typical Monday morning for them. The mill was right down here on the other side of the street, right close, real close to where the bridge is. And that's where the mill was built. And they soon discovered that all the people coming to town be an opportune time to sell something else, groceries, whatever. So they built a small store. History says it's just was close to the mill, so we don't know for sure where it was, but it was down in this vicinity somewhere. So anyway, the mill, that store, that first little store, has been refurbished, and if you go down to the Indoline Park sometime this weekend, it's down there, the old original store. It's been redone, of course, and I'm not sure that you can get in it because there was some flood damage a year or so ago, but you can see it from a distance. The interior is the old original interior. That's still 150 years old. So after about 20 years, the Curries sold the mill to Floyd Silvernail, who was another pioneer in this area, and old Floyd brought in his son Perny to help him. And in 1911, the water was so low at the lake and the river that they bought a gas engine and installed it in the mill so that they could continue to grind wheat when the old water wheel wouldn't work anymore. There wasn't enough water to turn the water wheel. So anyway, the mill operated successfully until about 1920 when they had plenty of water. In fact, it was a flood. and there were a couple of cottonwood trees. This area down here was all water. It was backed up. They had a dam here that he could control the water. And there was another dam about a mile out so they could control the water coming out of Lake Chetek. But anyway, that particular spring, there was so much water that it uprooted a couple of cottonwood trees out here, floated it down, broke right through the dam, and took out part of the mill. And there was so much damage that they decided not to rebuild. So that was the end of the mill. On the other side of the river, there was a Currie Creamery, but unfortunately that didn't last too long, but it was built just short, about 1890, and by 1908 it was no longer in use. So if we can walk up here, I'll try to go ahead. We'll stay on this side of the street. Can you hear it over there? You might have to hold that. You might have to hold that speaker up in the air a little bit. So anyway, in the 1880s, there was a blacksmith shop over there, operated by a man by the name of Louis Gates, who later sold out to the Pescus brothers. That's a name that you're probably familiar with. There was also a buggy and a wagon shop over in that area also. In 1891, Walter Sweetman and T.V. Comiskey constructed a building over in that area for their farm equipment and livestock livestock buying businesses. And by 1922, after the cars had become popular, there was also a Morris garage over there with gas pumps out in front. Unfortunately, 1923, that building was destroyed by fire. You pass around 403, there's two of them. So where you see the Joe Schreier construction building, in 1946, John Silvernail, who was the grandson of the former mill owner, Floyd Silvernail, he purchased that property, and he bought actually all the property from there all the way to the Des Moines River, and he built his tile factory, a Currie Block and Tile Company. He operated that from 1946 until 1965, when he sold the business to a couple of fellows from Worthington, Vern Suby and Keith Nerum. They continued to produce cement tile and cement block until the advent of plastic tubing. So you see when they're doing tiling out in the field today, it's big rolls of black tube. They don't use the cement tile anymore. The next building, number 4, by the time these photos get around to all of you, we'll be way up at the other end. The next lot of building was constructed in 1901 and was a drugstore. That was also owned by W.D. Savage. In the photo, which most of you can't see right now, there's a little lean on the north side of it. That was rented by the Worthington Produce Company, who bought milk and cream. That building was also one of the two that was destroyed in that fire. That building that you see there was built in 1923. It looks like it's been redone a couple of times, but it's basically the same building that was there in 1923. And some names that you might remember, Lee Remley had that building. He had an auto repair garage in there in the 1950s and 60s. And then Denny Johnson and Terry Carlson had snowmobile sales and service in there into the 1970s. Then it became a warehouse for mobile products, and today it is owned by the Schreier Cabinet Company as part of their business. So where you see the addition on the south side of that round building, you got to keep in mind way back when every lot was only 25 feet wide. So as we get later on in the tour, we'll look at the old bank building. That's a good example of what you could do with a 25-foot wide lot. You know, you could put a pretty good sized building in there, but they're all 25-foot lots. So right now we're looking at the south addition on that round building. Right there was a hardware store, and but owned by Louis Gates, the same fellow that had the blacksmith shop down here. He was really an industrious person. So he was appointed as the local postmaster, and so he converted that building into a post office and a grocery store. And if you look closely, if you're fortunate enough to see that photo, whenever it gets around, you can see underneath, if you look real closely, you can see the sign that says post office. So you have to look real closely to see it. So anyway, in 1911, C.A. Portman purchased that building and the Independent newspaper. And the Independent newspaper lasted in Currie until 1957, when we finally lost that newspaper. And I just want to ad-lib a little bit here. Newspapers are a tremendous asset to, I mean, we wouldn't have this history without those newspapers. We just wouldn't. You're not gonna, you can do Facebook and you can do all the technological things today, but there's something about having it in print that, that will survive for many years to come. So anyway, in 1957, we lost the newspaper here in town. And in 1960s, I'm not sure the exact date, Gordon DeLaurie purchased that building to store Pat's silo unloader and farm equipment. And he later operated a metal machinist business there. And then in the 1990s, Joe Schreier bought that building. He owns it right now. So Joe really has everything from that building all the way to the Des Moines River. And he also has this, the campground out here, which is relatively new. Photo number 6. So now we're way up to the corner, that big 2-story brick building sitting on the corner, Moe's Antiques. That was constructed in 1901 by Fred Meyer and his brother-in-law, Ed Bureau. It was operated as a Currie hardware and furniture company. They also offered mortuary services, including the sale of caskets. The upper floor, there was storage for Model T automobiles, which were taken up and down by means of a hand-operated elevator or lift. And it's my understanding that the mortuary service was in the basement, and it had an outside stairway. The only mortuary that I know of that was ever in Currie. In 1944, one of the partners, Mr. Meyer, was tragically killed in an automobile accident on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. He and his family were out there on vacation, and there was an automobile accident, and Mr. Myers was killed there. I say that as a little bit of a history part of it. That was the first automobile accident on the Golden Gate Bridge. So after that untimely death, the partner sold the business, and he sold the building. Mr. Fabe Maher purchased the building. Many of you probably remember Fabe. He operated a Gamble's store on the north half of the building, and Tony Engel, a druggist in town at that time, had the drugstore on the south half. If you go in that building, it's all open now, but there was a divider between the two. The building continued to have a hardware store under the ownership of Don Comiskey, Herman Zenz, Steve Zenz, and Chris Lamfers. The building now is 121 years old and in pretty good condition. Currently, Ramona Lindbergh has a consignment store in there, and I hope everyone will, at some time or another this weekend, go in there and see everything that she has there. It's really full. We'll direct our attention to this side of the street, and then we'll start walking up that way as we go. Photo number 7. Now in this particular photo, and it's hard to describe, there were 2 buildings down in this area that I have not been able to find out anything about them. I've looked in all the newspapers, and I've checked at the courthouse. I know who the owners were, but it didn't say anything about what the buildings were. There's a dark, unpainted 2-story building that was either destroyed or removed or something. It was just out of curiosity that I tried to find out, and it's the only 2 buildings in Currie that I don't know anything about. So anyway, there was another nice white building down there kind of behind the bushes or behind some trees. You'll see it in the photo, but you know, those 2 buildings were quite impressive. I can't imagine that there's nothing about them in the history books. But anyway, it remains a mystery yet to be solved. So this present building right here was constructed in 1998 by Tiny Halverson, who did a saw and blade sharpening business here. It's currently owned by Joe Schreier across the street, and he uses it for display of these lifts and the dock and windows and door display inside for his construction business. So we can continue walking up this way and pass out photo number 8. Okay, this large vacant lot right here, you can see the cement outline. It was quite a large building. That was built by Sweetman and Comiskey. If you remember, I said before that they had a building down there early on. Well, they destroyed that building or sold it, and they moved over here. They built a new building, and they built it in 1907. And this was where they had their farm equipment sales, as well as livestock buying operation. Comiskey, Sweetman sold out to Comiskey, and Comiskey continued until about 1936, when he sold to Louis Sikora. Louis Sikora had moved from further up the street into this building, and he continued with selling International Harvester farm equipment, Dodge and Plymouth automobiles, Philco radios, and Maytag washing machines. So he had quite a line of different variety of merchandise to sell. In 1946, Rollo and Burl Haycraft bought this building, and they continued with the International Harvester sales and service for a while before remodeling it into an egg-laying building. So then the building was full of chickens, egg-laying hens. And they continued that operation until into the 1960s when K.O. Silvernail bought it and used it for storage of old used tires. So we can keep walking up this way, or a couple of more lots here that are vacant. You'll see in that photo number 8 that's going around, there's 2 small wooden buildings there. One was used by Comiskey and Sweetman as a storage for coal and wood. But they would sell coal and wood from that building. The other building that was located about here was a temporary building for the Farmers State Bank. And it was temporary only till they built this building, which was built in 1913 by the Farmers State Bank. Those first officers, I don't know if any of these names mean anything to you. Theodore Zimmerman, Vice President, Henry Paul Sr., Cashier C.M. Hansen with an O-N, and Assistant Cashier G.A. Dummett. The bank closed in 1930 because of the Depression, and it never reopened. In 1941, the building was purchased by Postmaster Helen Gervais, who moved the Currie post office into that location. It had been down the street further. And so in 1941, it became Currie's post office, and it remains that yet today. So we can continue going down. Okay, so now we're at the second oldest building in the county. I say second oldest because when I first talked to you about Currie, the Currie store, the first little store that's now down by the end of Line Park, that was really the first one. But this is the oldest commercial building in the county as of today. Photo number 9. So the south half of the building was built in 1878 because the little store down by the mill had gotten too small for the business. So in 1878, they built half of this building. And it included the bank, the telephone, post office, not telephone, telegraph, and post office. Then as the business continued to grow, the north half was added in 1882. So if you see the 2 peaks up there, that's the reason for 2 peaks, because the 2 buildings were, he just added on and made it look just like the south half. So anyway, like I said, it's the oldest commercial building in Murray County today, and it's still here 144 years later and in pretty good shape. The upper floor was used extensively by the citizens of Currie. The Masons held their meetings up there. The Catholics held their services up there until they got a new church in 1881. And there's a stage on one end, this end here, where there were many plays held, dances, social events of all kinds. So socially, it was the place to be in Currie in the 1880s. You pass out photo number 10. So in 1905, Mr. Currie sold that business and the building to Henry Paul Sr. and to his partner, John O'Shea. Now, Mr. Paul eventually bought out 100% of the interest, and in 1916 he brought in his two sons, John and Henry Jr. Over the years, a number of owners have operated a grocery store here. Neil Currie, of course, the first one, then the Paul families, Frank Gardner, John Madden, John Levitt, and finally R.J. Elringer. The store then closed, and a group of Currie people got together and formed a corporation called CARE, C-A-R-E, which stands for Currie Area Restoration Enterprise. They sold shares to the public. They sold about $75,000 worth of shares so that they could recondition the building. And so it was operated under that CARE Corporation for 3 years, I think, before it finally closed. It was sold to T. Tommy, opened a supper club here in 2002, and it was eventually sold to Matt Schreier, who continued as Lakeside Hideaway and more recently as the Mill Street Barbecue. Today the building is closed to the public for most of the time anyway. They still use it as a source for a catering service. So hopefully it can be opened again. It's just too nice of a building and too much history to just leave it abandoned. So now I'm going to suggest that we move across the street over to that corner over there, and from there we're going to look down First Street both ways, okay? I guess you can stop wherever you're comfortable. Just watch for the traffic, so we don't block the intersection. So if we look down First Street this way to the east, on the other side of the antique shop, where that first gray building is located, there was a meat market there in 1907 operated by Vincent Huskra. Later on in the 1920s, there was a second building, photo number 11, we'll back up just a bit. Photo number 11, as you see it, is going to be how that store looked in the late 1990s when the CARE Corporation took over. And you'll see on there when we it had a brick facade on it. And we took the brick off because it was starting to crumble. And when we took it off, the name Neil Currie showed up on the old original siding. It was on the east side of the building. It's since been closed up, but you'll see it in that photo. Anyway, back to First Street. So the second building, there was another meat market where you see that yellow sort of a building down there. There was another meat market there that was operated by Bernard Sabota, and then later on Chris Jenigas in 1938, before he moved over to Mill Street up here. That later became a residence, as you'll see in photo number 12, wherever that's at. Yeah, that house there was the house of Mr. and Mrs. Joe Ockenfels for a number of years. about where that house was and maybe just a little bit further, there was a livery barn built in 1917 by two brothers, Hector and Howard St. Pierre. That livery barn was later under several other owners, including Peter Hansen and his son Raymond. The barn was eventually moved in 1925 to John Rupert Farm site outside of Currie. There were dray line services operated by a man by the name of Phil O'Brien, and another one, Tom Haynes, and the Hansons also after the arrival of the railroad in 1900. Dray services really became popular then. So photos 13 and 14. In the next block, we can't really see it here, it's in that trees over there. In the next block, Neil Currie built his home in 1880. The original home, and you'll see two photos of it being passed around, started out as a three-room home. So it was just a little building. And that was when they were building the mill down there. But anyway, that was later expanded to a beautiful 14-room home that you'll see in the photo, in those two photos. It was really an elaborate home. We can't even see the area, but it's kind of set up on a little bit of a hill there. And there was a story about Neil Currie and his family. Of course, he had the store right here, so he's just down the street, not much in his way at that time. He put in some sort of wasn't really a telephone, but it was a line from the house to the store. And so he would get on the line, they would talk to each other beforehand, and then Neil would run back home. He said, "I'm going to call you in a couple of minutes." So he'd get on the line down there and he'd say something like, "Hello, can you hear me?" And pretty soon the guy would come out and he'd wave. He said, "Yeah, I can hear you." So I guess, I don't know if that was the first communication in Currie, but it was kind of innovative. Okay, anyway, it was that beautiful home was constructed about 1880. I don't know if the date, I don't have that date in my head. But anyway, owners after that were, after the Curries, was P.M. Rupert, Joe Evans, and Rodney Howard. The home was torn down. It was sold by a group in Hadley that bought it for the lumber. So it was torn down in 1961. It's really a shame. You know, I love history, but it's a shame that we don't have that home yet. I mean, it really is, because it was certainly salvageable. But in the 1960s, you know, people maybe didn't care enough. So, now, if we look this way. So on the left-hand side, down where you see that green covered tent, okay. Photo 15, if you could get that. There was, in 1900, Joe Evans operated a blacksmith shop there. He operated that shop until 1939, when he sold it to Fred Severson. In 1946, the Ockenfels brothers, Paul and Fritz, bought that building and business and continued operating there until 1955, when they moved out west of town to the old implement building out there. In 1958, Jerry Bassett purchased the old blacksmith shop and he moved it to his farm outside of Currie, southwest of Currie. The American Legion purchased that whole block, or half of that block, in the 1960s, and established a city park, which was later purchased by Luke Radke, who has the tire shop across the road there. And he uses it just as a storage for vehicles that he's going to work on or has worked on. So, I don't know if we can see it from here. Down in the next block, there's a white building that is now the Currie City Shop. It was built in 1940s by Orrin Gleason. And Orrin's brother, Kenny Gleason, was the auto mechanic at that time. Orrin was an electrician, and he also sold television sets when they first came about. A little side story there. In 1954, the Catholic Church was celebrating its 75th anniversary, and they had a big drawing, and the grand prize was a television set. And lo and behold, my mother won that television set. And so it was a beauty. It was a 21-inch, about this big, black and white. We thought we had died and gone to heaven when we saw that. Anyway, in 1961, Ray Gleason, Orrin's son, purchased the business, and he continued operating in the auto repair business for many years before selling the building to the city of Currie. The next three buildings down on the other side, and you can't see them from here, but one is the Lake Chetek Area First Responders building, and the other two buildings are owned by Murray County for storage. And further west yet, outside of town, on the left side of the street out here, is a Hacker Trucking Company. We've got the former owner right here, Jim Hansen. What year did you build that building? 2001. Jim Hansen, who was in the trucking business at that time, built that nice building out there, and later when he retired, sold it to Paul Hacker. So now, direct our attention to this side of the street. So on the west side of this supper club, about where that tree is standing, there was a pool hall there built in 1891. Two photos, number 16. The building was occupied by many owners. I won't go through all that list. They're listed on the photograph. But it was a local pub. It was the place to be if you wanted a beer or just a little friendship and talk. And anyway, that building was finally raised in 2010, so it was there for a long time, from 1891 to 2010. Next, you see the brick building or the block building. That's Radke's Wheel Service. The original building prior to that one, you'll see in photo 17. It's a wooden building, as were most of the buildings. It was unusual to have a building like the one we talked about in the corner, and of course the bank building we'll talk about later. Most of the buildings were wood. And anyway, the original building that was there was constructed in 1902 and was known as the McCormick Building. It had several businesses over the years, including the Malo and Fortier Millinery, Martin Krogan's General Service, General Merchandise. Abe Goldstein had a grocery store and a general merchandise in that same building. Then in 1921, Louis Kieran continued in the grocery business there, and W.A. Gleason bought part of the building and had a gas station there. In 1924, unfortunately, there was a huge fire and it burned the building to the ground. And luckily, it didn't take anything else with it. They were able to contain the fire right there, but it burned the whole thing down. Pass out number 18, okay. So the following year, in 1925, W.A. Gleason, who had the gas station in the old building, bought the rest of the property, and he constructed that new cement block building that you see here today. The cement block in that building came from the Phelan Tile Factory, which was located about 4 miles southeast of Currie. So those block, that's what they were producing out there, along with cement tile. So there were numerous owners over the years in that building also. Obviously that nice big roof, there used to be a flat roof there, that has been changed over many years ago. On the west side of that Radke building, where you see that lean on, that other door, the big door on the left side, that was where there was location of a Broderick building. It's also shown in that number 17 photo that's being passed around now. In 1907, which is sort of interesting, that building was moved over to this lot right here. They actually moved the building diagonally across and set it right here. And we'll get on to what was that before later on. It's fortunate that they had moved that building in 1907 prior to the fire in 1920. Otherwise, that building wouldn't have been a building to move. There was another small wooden building constructed on the west side of that lean that had a grocery store that was operated by Arlie Gleason. You know, Arlie Gleason eventually moved over here. When Arlie moved over here in the 1940s, he sold that building to Anderson, A.A. Anderson and Sons, who operated an implement business. I mean, the building was only about 12 feet wide. So it's hard to imagine a farm equipment building operated. The tires are that wide today. And then in the 1950s, there was a small electrical and radio shop by Phil Jensen. Maybe some of you remember that name. The building was taken down prior to construction of that lean. Later in 1971, it was taken down. And then further down in 1930, on the far west end of that block, there's nothing there right now. It's a vacant lot. But Dennis Reardon and his son Cletus operated a mill and oat hulling business. Oat hauler. Of course, by 1930, the mill had been destroyed already, so there was nothing here. So he did about the same thing as they were doing with the mill down at the river prior to that. In 1947, on that lot, the village offered free outdoor movies, which every Thursday night during the summer months, they'd have a screen up out there, and this Phil Jensen that had that building would offer free movies. The telephone building that you see there, the kind of a light tan building, that was built in 1970, and it remains a telephone exchange building right now. Okay. Oh, I should say one more thing. On the west end of town, you can't see that from here, is Sweetman Construction. They have a nice shop out there, a big, huge shop that was built in 2017. And, well, here's the owner right here. prior to the present building that's there right now. If you pass out photo 19. In 1949, Creamery and his brother-in-law Edmund O'Connell purchased that property and constructed a cement block building and opened the Currie Implement Company, which included sales and service for Ferguson farm equipment. Many of you remember the Ferguson, similar like a little Ford tractor, but it was the Ferguson Company. In 1954, Lee and Webster rented the south half of the building for an auto repair shop, and a year later it was closed. Both businesses quit in there, the implement business and Webster's auto repair. And that's when Paul Ockenfels, who had been in the blacksmith shop over here, moved out to that building and operated his blacksmith shop out there. In 1970, Merle Wall bought the property after Paul Ockenfels had retired, and he operated a blacksmith shop out there for over 30 years. In 2015, Ed Sweetman purchased that property. He raised the old building, sold all the old iron and everything that was out there, cleaned it all up, and built the building that's out there presently. There are some grain bins that are a little bit further out. They were constructed in the 1970s by Smith's Grain Company, who still owns the property out there. How are we doing on time? Well,
you're okay.
Okay. Photo number 20. We direct our attention to the other side of Mill Street. So on the corner is the old bank building. It was constructed in 1901. It was the home of the First State Bank of Currie until 1928, when it closed due to the Depression. First officers of that building, of that bank, were F.N. Silvernail, who was the president, Walter Sweetman was the vice president, F.E. DeRoe was the cashier, and Claire Silvernail was the assistant cashier. At various times there were doctors who had offices in the back of the building, and also there was a barber shop in the basement. And when I said before a 25-foot lot, that's exactly what that building is, 25 feet wide. So you can see that they could put up a pretty good sized building in a 25-foot lot. In 1931, a new bank was formed in that building under the name of Currie State Bank. And the first officers of that bank was Henry Eislein, Henry Paul Sr., W.F. Sweetman, William J. Alexander, and William J. Phelan. Twice in our history, bank robbers entered that building. The first one was in 1948, when a lone amateur entered and he demanded money. Frank Fritz at the time was the cashier, and he had his office right there where the large window is. Well, the guy came in and he demanded money, and Frank heard that he was out there in the lobby. He came out of his office, he confronted the guy, and he says, "You're not going to get away with this, and you're not going to get any money." And he turned around and he walked back in his office to get a revolver out of his desk drawer, and the would-be bandit, out the door he went, didn't get a nickel. So good old Frank Fritz, he just, he had one up on him. He scared him, apparently. The second one, 1975, the last day of the year, and it was terribly foggy that morning. You couldn't see across the street. A man and a woman entered the bank with guns. demanded everybody to get down on the floor. They asked for money, and one of the tellers gave them money out of the money drawer. They got out. One of the vice president at that time chased them. They went out west of town, but because of the fog, they couldn't. They got away. They did find an abandoned car out there. The end of the story was both the man and the woman were apprehended. They were, a number of years later, they were found. In fact, the woman was out in California at that time. So FBI or whoever did it, they did their job. They got away with $1,080, which of course was never returned. But anyway, that's the bank robbery stories for Currie, luckily. The building was vacated in 1984 when the bank moved to a new building south diagonally across the street, up here on Mail Street. The building remains vacant today. The next lot where you see that Ken's Repair building, it's thought to, the history is a little bit vague, but it's thought that contained the first hotel in Currie, the Farmers Hotel, which didn't last very long. It was destroyed by fire in 1884. And we're lucky, again, the town was lucky, the wind was in the right direction, so the bank wasn't there yet. It was just that building, and luckily it didn't take anything else. The building that you see now was constructed in 1913 by Lemuel, Phil, and Jim Jensen brothers. They operated an auto garage, and they sold Studebaker, Jackson, and Chevrolet cars, and Minneapolis Moline tractors. And they later sold Ford cars. 1934, the south portion of that building was converted to a movie theater after the loss of the Rex Theater, which was up the street here a ways. In 1946, the building was sold to the Anderson brothers, who operated an Alice Chalmers implement and farm equipment business out of there for quite a number of years. In 1949, Joe Hollis purchased the Alice Chalmers dealership and operated it for about another 10 years. In 1961, Ken Gleason purchased the building, and he operated Ken's Repair, which did extensive auto repairs. The business continued for another 40 years with the assistance of Ken's son, Darrell. So the building is now owned by Ed Sweetman and he uses it just for storage. Pass out photos 21 and 22. So the two vacant lots right there between that and the white building at one time was the home of Gardner Hardware and Implement Company, which was built in 1891. In 1901, the south lot, so there's 50 feet there that's vacant. So the south 25 feet was the McCormick and Hassett wine room. It sounds kind of extravagant, doesn't it? At some point in time, the building was doubled in size, probably in the 1920s, which you see in photo 22. In 1931, Louis Secor opened the International Harvester Farm Equipment building in that double building, and he later was the one that moved down the street to the north here, to the old Comiskey and Sweetman building. It is unknown when that building was removed, but most likely in the 1940s. I don't personally ever remember seeing it there, so it was before my time, and that was a long time ago. The next building, photo 23, the next building was constructed, the big white one there you see, was constructed in 1934 as a city community hall. Originally, that was the site of the Fling Hotel, which was built in 1878. It was operated until, the Fling Hotel was operated until 1888, when, after Currie lost its battle for the county seat, Fling dismantled the hotel and had it shipped to Stanberry, Missouri. I never heard any more about it. I assume that it was rebuilt down there, but I don't know. In 1891, a new hotel was built on that same spot by Louis Bistrop. In 1901, under new ownership, the name changed to Hotel Gibbs. 1924. In 1911, again under new ownership, the building became the Pratt Hotel, so it went to 3 different people. So in 1915, Mr. Pratt, because of business, added a 3rd story to that hotel. So if you can imagine, 1915, in the town of Currie, they had the 2-story hotel already and it wasn't big enough. They added another story. You'll see that in that photo. Finally, in 1934, the village of Currie purchased the hotel and they dismantled it and constructed the building that you see there now. This building that you see was the center of activities for many years, including dances, free movies, basketball games. I remember playing basketball in there because I went to the Catholic school at that time. We didn't have an auditorium up at the school, and that was it. The playing floor, there was a 3-foot, just enough room on every side of the hotel, of the playing floor, for a bench or a chair, and it was up about 3 or 4 inches, so you knew where the out of bounds line was. But you know, that was when we got the new school in 1954. We thought, my goodness, they'll never build anything bigger than that. You know. Anyway, the building was the center of activities, like I said. The basement of that store had the municipal liquor store and the city offices. So and they weren't together either. That's lucky. They might have went from one to the other, but they weren't together. When the village constructed a new liquor store up the street in 1971, the building has remained basically vacant since then. The small tan building that you see right next to that white one was built in 1925 by Frank Pratt, who owned the hotel. And at the time, it was a creamery used by the Worthington Cream and Produce Company with Philip Ehrlich as the agent. And Philip lived in the house right next to it, which is still standing there. That house has been converted now to storage, but that was Philip Ehrlich's home at the time. In 1927, that little tan building was the Currie Municipal Liquor Store off sale until 1934, when that new community hall was built, and they moved the liquor store downstairs. 1935, the building housed barber shops and beauty shops, and with such proprietors as Walt Torgerson, Shorty Rivard, Tom Marlette, Jake Jacobson, Peter Neufeld, you probably remember Pete, and then Elaine Schlittke and Christy Johnson had a beauty shop in there. It's been vacant since the early 2000s. And next down the line, you can't see them from here, there were 2 houses, well, there still are. The first one, the green one, like I said, was the home of Philip Ehrlich, and later the Art Berry family, and it's now used for storage. Photo 25, please. On the far corner of the lot, where there is now a house, that used to be a Hayes Lucas lumberyard. In 1901, that lumberyard was built there. Currie actually had two lumberyards at that time. The other one was diagonally across the street where the liquor store is right now. It's unknown when the Hayes Lucas lumberyard was discontinued, but in 1931, that house on the corner had been built at that time, and I don't know how many years prior it was built. Over the years, it's been the residence of Hockenhall family, Clarence and Esther Morn, Ray and Clara Paul, Willard and Glenna Fogelson, and it's now owned by Joel Delory, who is doing the video here this morning. And it's now his home, and he also provides a bed and breakfast there on occasion. Now the last part of the tour. So now we can walk from here on, but first, before we start, where all of these vendors are located, this lot is vacant because we had a really serious fire here a couple of years ago that destroyed the building. The building that was constructed in the late 1880s and was the building that was down diagonally across that they moved over here. So photos 26 and 27. Photo 27 shows it was taken in the 1960s, and some of you, and most of you probably remember it was a drugstore from 1917 to 1944, but then in 1945, Arlie Gleason purchased the store, and it was Arlie's grocery store for so many years. All of us remember good old Arlie and Amelia Gleason, and that's where they had the store for many of years. And until about the 1970s, it was later operated by Tom Burns, Dwight Coster, Raymond Toby Pescus. All of them were selling groceries in there years later. In 1994, three sisters, Robin Leonard, Deb Bassett, and Wendy Steffen, opened the We Three Emporium, selling lunches and gifts in there. 1997, it became the Currie Corner, under the ownership of Joanne Beeren, who specialized in ice cream and gift sales. In 1999, Chuck and Trudy Skylock added archery equipment to the lunches and gifts that they were serving. And lastly, in the mid-2000s, Greg and Robin Hansen operated the ice cream and cake shop known as Sweet Treats and More Currie Corner. The building had been unoccupied a number of years prior to the fire. Photo 26, I think that's been out already, or not? Yeah. Okay, so in photo 26, which shows this side of the street back in 1911, the next 25 feet was, there was a small wooden building there. It housed Axel Anderson's shoe repair shop, and then later on another harness repair store. 1913, Rocking Hansen had a cream station in that building, and it was either torn down or moved because that lot remained vacant for many years. In fact, it was used as a horseshoe court for a while. So you can follow me. We're going to walk up the rest of this block now, and we'll talk about the buildings as we go along. So the building that I'm in front of here right now this building This building was built in 1949 by Floyd Silvernail and Pat Gleason. They constructed this building and used it as their plumbing and building supply business. They were carpenters and contractors at that time. Later on, Harvey Kieran and Henry Paul sold insurance in there for a few years until 1957. And then it became a medical office staffed by a Dr. Boyle, who was related to the Gervais family, and Dr. Patterson, who was in Slayton at the time. And the office was just open once or twice a week. Then a couple of years later, two veterinarians, Dr. Mears and Dr. Kanzenbach, operated a veterinary clinic, a satellite clinic out of here. Then Dwayne Pudgy, remember Pudgy? He operated a real estate and insurance office from 1962 into the mid-80s. Also, during that time period, there was a succession of beauticians, art and picture framing, videography, massage, a number of smaller businesses. Ed Sweetman is the current owner of the building, and this is his office for his sand and gravel business. Now we look at this brick building, photo 28. So we look at the north half of this building. So from the doorway this way, at one time was Fling's General Store. You'll see in that photo only about two buildings. One was Fling's store and the other one was the big Currie store on the corner. There wasn't much here other than those two buildings at that time. In 1890, this building, not this building, but the one that was here before, was under the ownership of John Gorman and Sons, and they sold general merchandise until about 1908, when they changed and included grocery sales out of here. In 1920s, a portion of the building housed Morris Electric. In 1927, under the ownership of Oliver Drinville, Pete Miller moved his barber shop and billiard hall to that building, and or to that location. In photo 29, in 1930, Herman Diedrich had a pool hall here, and also had Walt Torgerson had a barber shop in the front part. In 1941, owner Drinville added duck pins prior to bowling. Okay, it was a sort of bowling. He had duck pins in there, plus he put on a new brick front. Not the brick front you see here today, though. In 1945, Jerry Comiskey and Perny Silvernail opened Mick and Spike's Place, which was a combination duck pin alley and pool hall. And finally, it would later become Pa's Place. So the south half of the building, from the door over here, had a separate building, past 30. So it had several businesses over the years. Starting in 1885, the Dewey brothers opened a restaurant in that building. Several other proprietors that followed them were Art Kavanaugh, Fred Pumyer, Leon McConnell, and Don McCoy. I wonder if they ever considered an interstate through here. 1947, Perny and Bernice Silvernail purchased the building and connected it to Pa's Place, which was on the north side, so it became Ma's and Pa's. And in 1952, Perny removed the duck pins and he added a Mapaloma room. So I don't know how many of you remember going into the old Mapaloma room. It was a nightclub, really. It was a beer joint, and you could have music by the jukebox, and I don't think they had hard liquor in there, but it was a regular nightclub. So then now in 1958, in May of 1958, construction of a new bowling alley had just begun. But a disastrous fire, once again, another fire, hit this area and burned the interior of both of these buildings to the point where they couldn't rebuild it. So what they did was tore down the two buildings and constructed what you see here today, a nice building. It has a modern cafe, a 4-lane bowling alley, and that was all. The fire was in May of 1958. By December of 58, they had the new building up and running, and now known as the Mapaloma Lanes and Cafe. Been here since 1958. Several owners have occupied the building over the years. After the Silver Nails, Richard and Lois Hudson, Clinton and Ines Johnson. You remember they had the White Moose Lanes? There's a story about that too if we've got time. So Clinton Johnson and Perny Silvernail and a few other guys went up north moose hunting. So they were up there, I don't know where, if they were in Canada or if they were in Minnesota yet, but anyway, they were moose hunting. And lo and behold, Clint saw this white moose. And they had an Indian guide, Native American guide, I'm sorry, had an Indian guide who said, and Clint Johnson, he had pulled his rifle up already, and the Indian guide says, "Don't shoot that white moose, you'll go blind." Well, Clinton didn't pay any attention to that, and he shot and killed the white moose. And he had the head mounted, brought it back here, and the white moose head was hanging in this restaurant in the bowling alley side, and the place was renamed the White Moose Lanes. Clinton said later on, he said, "I think that was just a farce. There's nothing wrong with my eyesight." He was fine. Then the next owner was Merlin Lanou, then Jerry and Colette Pescas, Fred and Judy Patricelli, Mike and Renee Pescas, Rob and Schreier had the Sugar Shack here, then Brian and Karen Musser, Mark and Ashley Lavoie, and finally Leroy Scotting owns the building now and he leases it out as a cafe and bowling alley. Okay, the next lot. So this building was originally constructed in 1900, this one here, when Frank Pratt moved to Currie and operated a barber shop in here until 1911, when he purchased the hotel that was across the street. In 1919, Pete Miller constructed the building you see here today. There was an old wooden building like most of them were back then. He constructed this brick building back in 1919 at a cost of $10,000. It housed a 3-chair barber shop and a billiard hall. Oliver Drinville purchased the building in 1927 and operated a general merchandise store in there. In 1938, Chris Jenigas opened a meat locker plant here, and he operated that until 1952 when he sold to John and Corinne Ryder. Cleo and Shirley Hamus operated it after that, after the Ryders, and they had the locker plant here from 1975 until Laura May Wingate operated the Laura May's Beauty Shop in 2016. She has since moved that to Slayton, and the building is now owned by Pat Sweetman. The meat locker, some of you may remember Chris Jenigas, and I'm sure you remember John and Corinne Ryder. So they had the locker plant in there and grocery store in the front, and it was before many people had refrigerators, so they would store meat in their locker plant. You had a key to your locker, and you'd go in and get meat when you needed it, and then take it home and preferably eat it before the ice melted in your ice box. The next building photo 31. The next 25 feet was known as the tree lot because it was vacant for many years, only occupied by a tree growing, and the tree got to be quite tall. So it became known as the tree lot. But finally in 1907, a building was constructed which housed a pool hall. It seemed like pool halls and cafes were pretty popular. And barbershops. This pool hall was replaced by a cafe that was run by several people over the years. Carl Meyer, John Davey, Mr. and Mrs. A.G. Comiskey, Brad Ness, John Kelly, Leon Sear, Leo McConnell in 1945. 1946, the American Legion purchased the property and used it as their meeting hall as well as a bar. Just this half here. 1962, a person some of you might remember by the name of Doc Hunter, he hung out his Justice of the Peace sign, and he had an office in the back of the building. Good old Doc Hunter, he thought he was the police force for Murray County, I think, but anyway, he was the constable, he was the Justice of the Peace here. So it has continued under the Legion ownership ever since. Now the south half of the building, again, is amazing to note, the next building also had a cafe for many years. In 1908, F.T. Winkler opened the Nickel Plate restaurant. No less than 15 proprietors ran the restaurant business here until 1945, when a name that many of you are probably familiar with was the Berry Cafe, Ambrose and Margaret Cafe, Margaret Berry. In 1958, a large fire that destroyed Ma Paloma, Bernice Silvernail rented this building and had her cafe there until they got the new cafe built. The Legion Club purchased the building and joined the two buildings together and put on this new front that you see here today. So photo 32, and we move down the block here a little bit further. Now I haven't found any history of any business ever being located on this part, this 25 feet here, until 1927 when R.B. Bunkers opened a Case Farm Equipment building here, this first 25 feet. In 1937, Sylvester Cy Mink opened a harness shop And he also had hardware items here. In photo 32, in 1948, he added a 28 by 40 addition to the back of the store. In 1958, the building had Carl's Music Shop, where one could purchase used pianos and sheet music, and piano tuning and piano lessons were also offered. In 1962, Robert Brown purchased the drugstore from Mr. Engel, who was down in that corner down there. Mr. Engel retired, and Robert Brown bought his business and operated Brown's Sundries out of this building that was here. 2 years later, Fred and Fay Pumyer purchased the store and the business and renamed it Fay's Sundries. In 1979, the Johnson brothers, John, Laverne, and Craig, opened a Western boot and clothing store known as the Triple J Western Wear. In 2000, Bob Honeycutt purchased the building for storage, and later it was owned by the Currie State Bank, who took the building down in 2017. So it is now the north half of the Currie Bank parking lot. The next 25 feet, in 1907 and 1915, the building that was here was used as the Fairmont Creamery station, operated by Hilliard and William Bartlett as agents. In 1916, Walt Jensen and Albert Hansen removed the front of the building that was here and installed a new theater front and named it the Rex Theater. 2 years later, Jensen bought out Hansen's share. Many improvements were made to the theater, including a $4,000 organ in 1923. In 1929, talkie movies were introduced. Before that, they were silent. Little background music is all they had. Jensen always ensured that the latest technology was installed to make it a first-class theater, the best in all of southwest Minnesota at that time. By 1932, once again, fire. Fire destroyed the building. So Jensen started up again the movie business by going across the street to the garage of which he was part owner. So the old Ken's Repair Shop, he moved his theater into that part of the building and operated there for quite a number of years. This lot remained vacant after that fire, and it was eventually purchased by the Currie State Bank, and as you can see, it's the next 25 feet of their parking lot. Photo number 34. So the next 25 feet, there was a building that was constructed in 1904 by John Gorman. In 1920, Charles Gorman, John's son, opened a confectionery store here. In 1948, Cletus Reardon, 1925, after the big fire down on First Street, Louis Caron lost his merchandise in the building, and he moved to this building that was owned by John Gorman. And he operated his grocery and dry goods business out of there. 1948, Cletus Reardon, he returned to Currie after being gone for 5 years. He continued in the grocery business until 1954, when the store closed and remained vacant. A little personal note here. In 1968, Andrew Dold, who was my dad, purchased the property, and he dismantled the old store and used the lumber out at the farm. And I can remember Dad lived in town at that time, and he would come out to the farm every day, and then he would drive the pickup in, and he'd work here, taking that big wood building down by himself, pulling nails, stacking lumber in the back of the pickup, and then the next morning he'd haul it out to the farm and stack it out there until he had enough to build a hog barn out there. So, a lot of ingenuity, more than I had. In 1970, Dwayne Pudgy Pummier purchased that lot, and he installed a car wash. He later sold that car wash to Toby Peskis, who moved it down to the back side of Arley's grocery store down on the other end of the block. In 1983, the Currie State Bank became the owner of this lot, and eventually it was used as the drive-up window for the bank. Now, where the new beautiful Currie State Bank building is today, those two lots in photo 35, those two lots held a livery stable and a small storage shed that was owned by W.J. Adkins. In the early days, there were several livery stables in town. There was one down on East First Street. There was one behind the hotel. There was one behind the fire hall up there, and there was one right here in the corner. So, and they were all here at the same time. So there was 4 livery stables in town at that time. They all continued to prosper, especially before the coming of automobiles. Of course, when the automobiles came, the horses became more of a pleasure animal rather than a work animal. In 1937, Joe Hollis constructed a 22 by 25 foot cement block garage, and then 8 years later, he enlarged it and put on a round roof. Photos 36. Well, K.O. Silvernail purchased the business in 1952 and opened Silvernail Standard. He provided all types of car services, including tire sales. Subsequent owners were Keith Herbs, who had Keith Standard, Terry Carlson and Denny Johnson. They had moved their snowmobile and sales service up here. And in 1983, the Currie State Bank became the owner of that property, and they constructed the new bank building, which was finished in 1984. The bank remains in the Hanson family to this day, and it was enlarged in 2018. This other addition was put on, and they moved the drive up a little bit further out to the side of the street. Across the street in 1905, the second lumber yard that Currie had was constructed by Laird Norton Company. It was eventually purchased by Botsford Lumber Company, and it was later owned privately by Ted Wall. In 1976, the city of Currie purchased those lots across the street up there, and they removed the old lumber yard and built a new liquor store. As it was previously noted, the Currie liquor store was down in the basement of that building. And so when that liquor store was constructed and finished, then they moved the liquor store up there. It was owned by the city for quite a number of years. Currently today it's privately owned by Greg Kiley. And lastly, across the street, there's two houses, and on the other side of the second house, in 1903, Currie constructed its first fire hall. It served the community well until it was taken down in 2017. The Currie Fire Department has a beautiful new building up on 3rd Street behind the water tower up there. The fire department moved to the former Currie Public School gymnasium after that school closed in 1975. So the fire department was up there for a number of years until they got the new one now. So today the fire department enjoys a new and larger fire hall up there. Well, I want to thank everybody for remaining loyal here this morning. My goodness, if your legs are as tired as mine, you'll probably want to go sit down. I'm so happy to have shared some of the history of Currie. Obviously, we just talked about the business district. We didn't talk about the churches or any of the other houses in town or any of that. But enjoy the weekend. Enjoy celebrating with us 150 years of Currie, Minnesota. Thank you.